Hi there. The news that HBO is considering pitches for multiple Game of Thrones prequel shows, like Tales of Dunk and Egg and Robert's Rebellion, has sparked off a lot of discussion between the major fan channels on YouTube about can there be a cinematic universe of sorts for Game of Thrones? There was this wonderful discussion online panel hosted over on Tony Teflon's channel. I'm going to link you over to it in the description box below. It was him, Gray Area, a couple other big channels. I was in the chat, and they'd sometimes read off of something I said when I had a point, because other people were visiting in the chat room as well, because we couldn't have 20 people talking at the same time. And it was really great. I don't think anyone thought it would be as big as it turned out to be, this discussion, that so many people actually showed up. And it was great. It felt like a virtual convention panel for like a Comic-Con or something. You have people really discussing what they thought they could do with it. Everyone made a lot of good points. But just the title, can there be a cinematic universe? Yeah, I think there can. Well, what's the difference between a cinematic universe and a franchise? I mean, there's the X-Men franchise in the 2000s. It's movie franchises versus a cinematic universe. I'm not sure what the distinction is. But even HBO said, look, guys, this is never going to be as big as the Marvel Cinematic Universe or even the Star Wars TV universe, and we know that, but we can make more than one project. So I think we're not looking at, like, comparing this to Star Wars' huge announcement a few weeks ago of 10 new shows in different formats. But, like, could this be like what Star Trek does on CBS All Access, which is about to turn into Paramount Plus, I know, but that they've got Picard and Discovery and an animated project, Lower Decks, and a couple other things in the works. That they've got more than one show. Does that constitute a cinematic universe? Not sure. But due to the way the prequel stories are structured, there wouldn't really be crossovers because they don't happen at the same time. They happen linearly. So this wouldn't be like, in Star Wars terms, how you can have, they announced we're going to have The Mandalorian Season 3 running opposite the Ahsoka show and the Rangers of the New Republic show, and meant to have crossovers, like how Netflix's Marvel shows had the Defenders crossover, and now the Marvel shows on Disney Plus will be building to crossovers between WandaVision and Falcon and Winter Soldier and with the movies, that you really can't do that with this. So it wouldn't be Mandalorian plus Rangers of the New Republic having a crossover. This is instead like having Mandalorian and a High Republic show at the same time, but they're set hundreds of years apart. Or the Kenobi show, it's a different time period than the Mandalorian, and they might discuss similar things. Also, because dragons can live for like 200 years, sometimes they would appear in more than one if it's set early enough. I mean, there wouldn't be dragons from the Dance of the Dragons living through Dunk and Egg, though the dragons had died by that point. But you get the idea. That they can play around with, this is Blackfyre, the sword of the kings, and then you see it in a different one. So this is a really great discussion. Just made me go, I need to do a follow-up to the first video I did in this because there's a lot more to say. Because for people who aren't familiar with the source material, well, how many prequels could you make? And short answer, there's about 6 ideas that you could easily launch into that aren't direct sequels to something else, which also have sufficient source material. But then you get into questions of, is this oversaturating the audience? Or would people who just watch Game of Thrones without the books even be familiar enough with this to want to see it? So there's 3 factors of source material. Is this so much of a direct sequel you can't just jump into it? And audience demand, audience familiarity. Start with the first one, Targaryen Conquest. This is one you could jump right into. But the direct sequel to Targaryen Conquest is the Sons of the Dragon era. It's a novella called Sons of the Dragon, but it's about the war known as the Faith Militant Uprising. It's the war between the faith of the Seven and the sons of Aegon, Aenys, and Maegor, and Maegor becomes a tyrant. Now, when I say the Targaryen Conquest show, I'm envisioning a 6-season show that runs from the start of the conquest through the death of Maegor. That it covers 50 years. That there's 3 big subsections. The conquest itself, which might be 2 seasons. The first Dornish War would be one season. And Martin has said that the Sons of the Dragon novella has 3 books worth of content in it in terms of act breaks. That there's the outbreak of the war, the rise of Maegor, and the fall of Maegor. So that would be like season 4, season 5, and season 6. So you wouldn't jump right into Sons of the Dragon, but it would be like, if you're planning this as a 6-season show, the whole combined thing would be called the Targaryen Conquest show, even though it ends like over 40 years after the Conquest happened, because a lot of the characters from the Conquest are still alive. I mean, Queen Visenya, for example, she is still fighting at the age of 80 from Dragonback. She's Burning Faith militant, and she would live all the way through the final season. She dies of old age. So you can see that as one big era, and I'll mention other things where this is such a direct sequel to something else, you couldn't really just jump into that. The second major prequel era is the Dance of the Dragons, which is what House of the Dragon is covering. After the Dance of the Dragons, you have the Regency era, also called the Aftermath era, that Westeros was so devastated that it took them a generation to recover, but it's this interesting era of intrigue and fighting among the ashes, and most of Westeros has descended into near anarchy, and they need to reestablish order, and there's still a lot of private wars going on that in many ways the war never ended because the Lannisters just kept fighting the Greyjoys, and the Vale falls apart in civil war, and there's famine and plague everywhere, and all this intrigue at the royal court between the Regency Council from the two sides. It's great stuff, and it's got like 4 chapters from Fire and Blood in it so far. He's going to continue it, but it would be incomprehensible to launch into a Regency show without doing the dance first. So think of the dance as prequel era 2A and the Regency as prequel era 2B. That there's even more material in the Regency than there is in the Sons of the Dragon. This would be like 4 to 5 seasons worth of material. So I don't know if you'd call this, it's the debate over, do you have one big 8-season long show or 10-season long show? Or do you have 2 separate shows, 5 seasons each? Because people, complaining that Game of Thrones was shorted by season 8, and Martin and HBO saying, we would have given you 10 seasons if you asked for it, that you rushed it too much. So like that, if I can see the actual war part of the Dance of the Dragons lasting 4 seasons. It's 2 years in universe, but it's like 4 act breaks. And at least 1 season for the Rogue Prince era, so I can see the Dance of the Dragons show lasting 5 or 6 years, up until the end of the war, and it's, well, then do you have season 5, the Regency, or do you rebrand it as season 1 of the new Regency show as a direct sequel series? But you would never just launch into the Regency. That's a sequel. So when I say the Dance of the Dragons era, loosely that extends from the year 101 AC at the Great Council of Harrenhal to like 160 AC. That's like 60 years worth of stuff by the time it's the end of the reign of Aegon III, and you're moving on into the reigns of his sons, which are a chapter break with what came before. Now, as you'll have noticed, there's some linker material, bridge material that Martin wrote in Fire and Blood in November of 2018, these new chapters to finally bridge the gap between the death of Maegor and the outbreak of the Dance of the Dragons, and, starting with the Great Council at Harrenhal, that it was this 50-year reign of peace under King Jaehaerys in which not much happened, and he never wrote about it before. So for the Fire and Blood hardcover anthology, he said, I'll round it out a bit. It turned into a quarter of the book, and it's some of the best stuff he's ever done in terms of character work. I don't know how photogenic it is, though, because, there's time skips on the scale of decades. So if they ever did Jaehaerys in live action, it would be like as season 7 or 8 of a Conquest show, or a direct sequel to a Conquest show. If you go Conquest, Sons of the Dragon, if the finale of Sons of the Dragon is a ratings hit, and it's really popular, I could see the fan demand to go, well, what happened after that with young Jaehaerys? Because it's the time skips don't happen until the later chapters. It's the immediate aftermath of Maegor and wrapping that up. it might be better suited to live action. That, like, if we ever get a Conquest show, I'll be fighting for, go ahead and do Jaehaerys after season 6, because that's the next one. But for now, I mean, for the next 7-year period, within the next year, HBO could release Jaehaerys and Alysanne as an animated project, as a bonus. Obviously, we don't have Targaryen Conquest, but release it as like an animated prequel to House of the Dragon. House of the Dragon Season 1. Old King Jaehaerys, when he's a really old man, it's the end of his reign, might even appear in live action in House of the Dragon Season 1 as a cameo. Well, we don't know. It sounds like we'll see the Great Council. So I'm on board with that. That I've said that, everyone really likes those Histories and Lore motion comics that they package with the Blu-rays for Game of Thrones, giving backstory stuff. Well, the backstory to House of the Dragon is Viserys' grandfather, Jaehaerys, and what led to this succession crisis, and what the Old King was doing. So I'm pretty sure that in one format or another, we will hear the story of Jaehaerys and Alysanne in the bonus content for House of the Dragon Season 1. And I envision that as just, like a Histories and Lore, maybe even how like for Season 7 they made a 40-minute motion comic movie of the Targaryen Conquest, which they packaged with the Blu-ray, gave some special screenings for. It was fun. I thought we might even get something like that, and then just today HBO announced, we are going to put money into high-quality animated projects for this. And my theory is that we might not be getting motion comics anymore as a bonus thing, but they'll have a tie-in release with the Histories and Lore will, as a natural outgrowth, evolve into being these tie-in animated features they make at higher quality. So we might be looking at like a 1 hour, 2 hour animated thing, depending on how they cut up the internal chapters on, okay, this is what happened with Jaehaerys and Alysanne as a coherent story, and they'll release it like after the season 1 finale of House of the Dragon, just to keep fans interested, to help bridge the gap during the off season while they're making season 2, to fill up time that way. That's a great idea. That transitioning from they're just bonus things we put on the Blu-ray to, look, these things are so popular, they justify spending more money on them and showing them off. People are willing to pay for them and spend time watching them. They're pretty popular because they're mostly straight up adaptations of the books that Benioff and Weiss didn't write. But they're not going to launch into that as a live-action project. That'll be like a sequel to the Conquest show, which is itself Conquest and then Sons of the Dragon. Animated thing in abridged form. Any animated thing that's 2 hours is not the same as a full 10-episode season in live action. I can see an animated project for that as an extension of the Histories and Lore, but that's not a thing. So we got Targaryen Conquest is an era. Dance of the Dragons is an era that you would cover with a live-action show because it's that important. And then after the dance and the Regency end, the third prequel era, and I use the term loosely in this instance, is the Blackfyre Rebellion. Not just the actual war, which lasted 1 year, but thinking of the broadly conceived Blackfyre Rebellion era as this whole time period lasting 50 years, with 3 distinct subsections. A more exaggerated version of just as, well, the Targaryen Conquest is really the Conquest, then the First Dornish War, then Sons of the Dragon. The through line for the Blackfyre Rebellion is the life of King Aegon IV, Aegon the Unworthy, the most corrupt king in the history of Westeros. That you wouldn't just start off with, outbreak of the Blackfyre Rebellion, here's these people fighting. You need to set up who they are and why they don't like each other. That the Blackfyre Rebellion was a war that broke out on the death of Aegon IV between his true-born son Daeron II, Daeron the Good, and his bastard son Daemon Blackfyre. And it sort of follows this 3 acts of, if that's the aftermath of Aegon IV's death, and the middle act is the corrupt reign of Aegon IV, going backwards, part 1 is his youth when he's this spoiled princeling and you see the court politics that shaped him. Mostly because this time period doesn't really fit anywhere else. It's broadly set up for the Blackfyre Rebellion era. Basically, think of it like how the Tudors, the TV show, depicted the life of Henry VIII and how it unfolded through different phases of his life across many decades. And if they kept that running by having a show about the aftermath and the wars of Elizabeth and Bloody Mary, it would start with Aegon IV in the background, while his father was Hand of the King to his older brother, and then when Aegon III died, his father, Viserys II, as you see in the chart here, remained as Hand of the King for his two older cousins, Daeron I and Baelor the Blessed. But everyone said Viserys II was the real power behind the throne in a good way, that Daeron was always just worried about military stuff and conquest and not ruling. Baelor was a religious buffoon. He was probably insane, even though people liked him because he was non-violent. He was this utter pacifist and kind of really crazy. That Viserys II was the real power behind the throne, and because they both died childless, he became king for like a matter of months. And then suddenly, really far down the line of succession, came Aegon IV, who no one expected to be king and no one wanted to be king because he hadn't been trained to be king his whole life. That he was just the lazy minor cousin who suddenly became the guy sitting on the throne. So you'd set that up in part one of such a show for like a season, maybe two. And then the middle of it, now Martin himself has actually said for years that he's wanted to do a story on the corrupt reign of Aegon IV, and it would be a dark comedy in the style of Blackadder. He's this utter sleazy villain, but he's cunning like a fox and is always outwitting the heroes, and you're kind of rooting for the bad guy. Again, like Henry VIII and the Tudors. And if you read the World of Ice and Fire chapter on Aegon IV, you can tell he's written a lot on this. They even said, the authors of it, we left out notes from this. He has extensive notes on the reign of Aegon IV that he hasn't shared, because he just had fun writing it. Of his 9 different mistresses at one time or another, all of his follies, that would be the middle act. And you can see how Aegon IV directly ties into the Blackfyre Rebellion, that you'd see his young sons and their growing rivalry at court, and the split over, do we ally with Dorne through marriage or not, and then the opposing political factions. And that would be like seasons 3 to 4, and that's so like 5, 6, 7-ish. The final season is the climax, where you actually have the Blackfyre Rebellion after all of this setup. And this is the loosest defined prequel era. It's not like how the Conquest, you can see how, yeah, it starts with them landing and ends with Maegor's death 50 years later. This is just because I can see putting Aegon IV with the rebellion. The reigns of his cousins that came before him is just because it doesn't really fit in anywhere else. It wouldn't make a good standalone show other than dash off Daeron the Young Dragon and Baelor the Blessed in one season just to include them for the sake of completion. So there's a couple of reasons why Blackfyre Rebellion is probably the weakest of these 6 major eras you could plausibly do without setup. That it's got the least source material, there's no dragons in it, it needs a lot more setup. Moving on. The 4th big prequel era is, of course, The Tales of Dunk and Egg, which is about all the other subsequent Blackfyre rebellions after the first one. The first one was the biggest one. And that is planned to cover 50 years, which takes us all the way up to the 5th big prequel idea, Robert's Rebellion. This is really why I made this video, that I want to discuss this again, because people made good points in the comment section of my last video that I kept saying, I don't see how this will last more than 1 year, and people made a convincing argument that you could do 3 seasons to me. That they said, well, they could do a 1-season, relatively short follow-up on the Greyjoy Rebellion. It's not as big of a war, and it's mostly just an excuse to see the young Stark children, or cut away to a cameo of young Daenerys living as a beggar in the streets of the Free Cities with her brother. But, just to tie it all together, yeah, there should be a follow-up to that, unless you're racing through it and cramming it all into 10 episodes. That'd be like the final episode of a 10... If there's only Robert's Rebellion is 10 episodes, you'd do Greyjoy in episode 10, but I can see how you could pad that out to a shortened final season. And okay, that's 2 seasons, and they said, well, maybe the first season could be set up showing the court rivalry and showing Rhaegar and Lyanna falling in love, and then most of the war happens in season 2, and then Greyjoy Rebellion season 3, so maybe not 10-episode seasons, but okay, there might be 3 act breaks in Robert's Rebellion. So the people in the comments section changed my mind. You're right, you could do that. Not more than that. And then I said there's some things which aren't really major prequel eras, but would be a sequel or a prequel to something else. As an addendum to that, you have what a couple of people suggested, young Tywin and the Rain Rebellion. Martin gave a lot of backstory about the Rain Rebellion in the World of Ice and Fire chapter on House Lannister, and he said these are actually notes I had for the main novels. I didn't make them for the World book. They've been a core part of my conception of Tywin and the Lannister family dynamics for a while. And if you've read them, tell me in the comments, you read it and go, this would make a good one-shot miniseries or something. It's enough material, not just with Tywin. I mean, he's only born halfway through it. It's the rivalry between his mother and the Lady Ellen of House Rain, and the War of the Wombs between them, and this court rivalry. But this isn't a distinct prequel so much as, well, one of 3 things. It would either be the last installment of the Tales of Dunk and Egg, it would be a standalone, or you could make it season 1 of a Robert's Rebellion show. Because it happens at the beginning of Aerys's 20-year reign, and then the end of that 20-year reign is the rebellion that overthrows him. So there's a time skip. Tywin would be played by different actors. That isn't a bad thing. So on the balance, I'd accept do a one-shot Tywin, then do Robert's Rebellion after that. Collectively, this is a 4-season show. Set up to the rebellion. 3rd season's the actual rebellion, then sort of a coda with the Greyjoy Rebellion and seeing the younger teenagers that we'll later see in the TV show as small children. I can see that running for 4 seasons if you do everything for 50 years. And it could work. It wouldn't be a long show. We're not even talking, 5 to 7 as opposed to like Game of Thrones ran 8. We're talking 4 maximum. And not that expansive. But the thing it has going for it is it has the most audience familiarity. I mean, it's a direct prequel with younger versions of some of the older characters. Ned Stark we've seen in flashbacks. This isn't that out there of an idea that people will be really excited to see younger versions of the same characters. And everyone goes, Rhaegar and Lyanna, Ned, why is no one shouting, wow, we'll see a younger version of Stannis successfully leading the Siege of Storm's End? I would be excited to see a young version of Stannis seeing the Siege of Storm's End. That saved the whole war. Why aren't there any songs about that? It's all, everyone's saying, we're going to see the Trident, we're going to see the Trident. I'm serious, in the comments section, everyone talking about, we're going to see Rhaegar at the Trident. What about the Siege of Storm's End? What about Stannis? Why aren't you talking about that? That saved the war. I digress. But okay, I see if you pad that out, if you go, pad it out, if you combine 2 shorter things into 1 longer show, that's like 4 seasons you're looking at there. Because, the through line is that Tywin lives through all of it. I can see that. So, broadly, and depending on how you cut it, there are basically 5 big prequel eras for things set in Westeros. Targaryen Conquest, Dance of the Dragons, Blackfyre Rebellion, Tales of Dunk and Egg, Robert's Rebellion. And then in a few cases you have bridge material that you'd have to go, well, this is either the final season of the one show or a prequel, a prelude setting up season 1 of the next show, that Jaehaerys and Alysanne, that's something you do as a sequel to Sons of the Dragon Conquest. Young Tywin doesn't work as a final Dunk and Egg so much as the first season of a Robert's Rebellion, depending on how you cut it. But those aren't full eras. Those are where you decide to cut the bridging the gap stuff. Like, is a Kenobi show more of a part of the prequel trilogy or the setup prequel to the original trilogy? Well, it's a bridge thing. It's not a full thing on its own, nor is it supposed to be. But that's what we're looking at here. These are the big eras by material because Martin didn't write that much stuff before the reign of the Targaryen dynasty began, uniting Westeros, forging the Iron Throne, which happened 300 years ago. So the most detailed material is the last 3 centuries in Westeros itself. So the 2 other things you can look at are ancient history in Westeros, or shows set beyond Westeros in different time periods. Well, the 2 big things in Westeros before the Targaryens were the Long Night 8,000 years ago and the Andal invasion 6,000 years ago. But he barely wrote anything about them. They're not interrelated, and they just cry out to be, this should be an anthology. This is not a unified story. And we already have the example of the wrong way to do this with the failed attempt by HBO to make a Long Night prequel pilot, where it wasn't an anthology. They just hammered all these unrelated things together. It's like, people are like, oh, we'll see Yeetie and the Starks, and it's Martin never wrote that as a coherent story. And these writers don't know how to do that. And on top of that, there are some things that have nothing to do with the Long Night. Even Yeetie or other areas that experience the Long Night as a global catastrophe, you could kind of make the argument that the mages and warlocks of the world all were fighting against it, but there's stories that have nothing to do with that, like the origin of House Lannister, that, from what we've heard from all the prequel leaks, which I've done on my channel, I mean, and set photos and pretty much descriptions from Martin confirmed that this show is going to shoehorn the origin story of House Lannister into the origin story of the Starks, even though they're unrelated. And I don't know if that would make a good TV show if you hadn't read the books, but it sounded ridiculous. At the very least, it was made up. And just hammering that square peg into a round hole. The whole Long Night thing, for the more we hear about it, was this Frankenstein TV show just combining things that were never meant to be combined. Like, there are people going, oh, it's the Age of Heroes. It'll have During God's Grief in it. Why? The guy who built Storm's End, he ancestor of the Baratheons. This has nothing to do with the Long Night. Like, how would you make this? These guys live in different parts of the continent, centuries apart. Even Star Wars is treating the High Republic stories as more of a broad era or setting for different series to be set in as anthologies than one giant interconnected thing. Well, there's a galactic event, there's a hyperspace catastrophe, but there'll be branching storylines where not everyone meets everyone. And I'm really feeling better that they said they're going to put money into high-budget animation, because it makes more sense to do that the way the Histories and Lore did it, just with more runtime and quality animation at high budget, with real voice actors and real writers. And when I say animated, it could be cell animation, it could be Star Wars, Clone Wars, CGI. I don't know, I don't care, I'm here for the writing. You do that as an anthology. And is it like a series of shorts? Or is it an anthology the way American Horror Story is an anthology, where you do get one coherent story across 10 episodes, and then the next season they switch to something else? I could see that working too. There's a few different ways to do an anthology, but Long Night and Andal Invasions are better suited to anthologies. Usually when they do an animated project, they try to do anthology stuff. I'm feeling more confident about that. So I'd like to think they learned their lesson from being burned so badly by the failure of Long Night, that no, we cannot just make a Frankenstein throwing all these unrelated things together to try to make a coherent story. It doesn't work. It's not a flagship TV show. Because then you get to, okay, that's before the Targaryens in Westeros. What about beyond Westeros? As it turns out, HBO is taking that seriously. That one of the 5 pitches that they initially made in summer 2018, we later found out and confirmed, was Old Valyria. Their linguist, David J. Peterson, confirmed it, that the third of the 5 pitches was Valyria. Only 3 pitches survived until summer 2019. We don't know what the 4th and 5th ones were. The 4th one was probably Targaryen Conquest, probably passed on because it was too similar to the dance. We have no idea what the 5th one was. I mean, I have no idea. Blackfyre, Robert's Rebellion, doesn't matter now. Maybe they'll recycle it. We may never know, or maybe they will tell us. But the third idea, which has story bibles and series outlines and everything, is Valyria. And when I say Valyria, It's about the Valyrian Freehold, which is this fantasy Roman Empire stretching across half the known world. So it's not just Valyria. A lot of the show in the series Bible says, well, a lot of it's about the provinces of Valyria, which stretch from the Free Cities to Slaver's Bay to Sothorios. We know from the World Book they have provinces in Sothorios, which is their fantasy version of Africa. And they said, well, to try to show more of the world, the two big settings are Valyria itself and their wealthiest province, which is the trading port capital of Sothorios province. So it's like their version of Roman Carthage, Roman North Africa, and it's this crossroads of the world, this huge port. And it says in the thing, the way we're going to work in other regions that people come to the port. So there's a large population of Summer Islanders in Sothorios. There's a large population of people from Yiti who they come in on the trade route around the Jade Sea. So not just, oh, it's diversity, it's you have the Valyria show, and from that you can have spin-offs in the next phase on the Summer Isles or about Yiti, which right now the TV audiences know nothing about Yiti, and they've heard the name Summer Isles, but they haven't really been told what it's like, which was a shortcoming of the TV show. That if you haven't seen it, check out the World of Ice and Fire's relatively long chapter on the Summer Isles, explaining this is what their history is like. There's enough of a coherent story about this is when they were independent, then they got attacked by pirates who were doing slaving raids. Here's the warrior queen who united the Summer Isles against all the invaders and set down their laws, but then they had more internal troubles. Like, there's enough of a narrative that I would really like to see them make, like, a 10-minute, 30-minute animated high-budget thing that they're discussing on just adapting the history of the Summer Isles chapter from the World Book, like a 20-minute animated thing on it, as sort of a backdoor pilot to, would people like to see this as a live-action project for a 10-episode run? So that's the great thing about animated anthologies. They serve as backdoor pilots to things. So the Valyria show would serve as a backdoor pilot to other things. It would be the spin-off for, as soon as the Doom of Valyria is over, it just keeps following the characters who survive in the Free Cities during the Century of Blood. That's just a direct sequel. And from that, you could also do other prequels on the Summer Isles. And a lot of people want to see Yiti, which is like fantasy China times 10. It's just the scale is amazing. They're the oldest civilization. They've existed for 8,000 years of continuous history since the Long Night. Valyria fell. They didn't. All of other history is a speck on time compared to them, the first and oldest civilization. And just we hear very little about it, even in the World Book, but just enough to whet our appetite of this place is steeped in history and there's a lot of stories to tell. And it's this whole other expansive thing that a lot of you are probably saying, well, why don't we do Nymeria and the 10,000 ships of the Rhoynar? That's the rise of Valyria. This is the fall of Valyria. And I think they might do that as flashbacks, but a TV audience doesn't even know what the Rhoynar are right now. That I think you go with the touchstones. If people know there's Targaryens, there's the fall of Valyria. I like to hope we'll get Nymeria and the Rhoynar as a spin-off prequel of Empire of Ash, as like a one-shot or something. That is, as it just keeps branching out, the branching out like a tree. Even you get a spin-off. Now, the spin-off gets a spin-off. That's the order I think they'll do it in terms of phases. So the fact that they're hearing pitches again really gives me hope that they're reconsidering the Valyria prequel pitch. A lot of that info came directly from Martin from unpublished notes. It says in the series Bible, Martin sat down and told us in outline form, okay, this is what the politics of Valyria were like and what the provinces were like. It's like a lost section, major subsection of the World of Ice and Fire on Valyria that he never got to, that he just gave them his notes. It's like the World of Ice and Fire Volume 2. So what do I think at maximum we could be looking at? I want House of the Dragon. I wanted to get the focus it's due. And I really hope it's not like a 3-season show. It deserves to be a 6-season show followed by the Regency. But I want House of the Dragon to be the primary one. And then Dunk and Egg specials, those are movies. Robert's Rebellion as a limited run show would be great, because it's not a full show, it's like half a show, because it's only 4 seasons at most. And then, depending on how much money they want to put in this franchise, have the third thing be Valyria. Anything else would be redundant. I mean, would you want, if they do a third one, and that's a big if, Dunk and Egg counts as movies, if the first one is Dance of the Dragons and the second one is Robert's Rebellion, do you really want the third one to be the Conquest or Blackfyre Rebellion? Or would you rather have something new and different like Valyria? Because the other ones are retreads. So if there is a third one, heck, they might even pass on the idea of doing Robert's Rebellion right away, because Martin's always been iffy about it, or because it wouldn't be long enough, and just skip straight to Valyria. Things are in motion, or maybe the pitch they actually get just isn't very good due to the quality of the writing. That's a big X factor. Even though we could make a big pitch, the writers they're hearing from on this might not make a good pitch. I mean, House of the Dragon, the Dance of the Dragons, was originally a pitch by Cogman. He was too busy working on season 8 to do a good pitch, so it was rejected. I mean, by his own admission, he said, I didn't have enough time to put the work in I needed. And then they started over from scratch with a pitch from someone else. So for all we know, the pitch for Robert's Rebellion isn't something they actually like what they see, but they like the Valyria one more. I don't know, but all this news about all these prequels, and on top of this, and they said it's not animated Dunk and Egg, separate from the live-action Dunk and Egg pitch. We're hearing pitches for animated projects. So yeah, I mean, what is the question for the comments section? What is the difference between a large franchise and a cinematic universe? Is that just a buzzword going around? Like, Star Trek has 2 live-action shows and a cartoon running now. That's considered a franchise, but a Marvel Star Wars Cinematic Universe or the DC Cinematic Universe, those are huge, sprawling movie things. But, TV shows, we call them franchises. In my day, we called them franchises, and we liked it. Still, these are the 6 big contenders we're talking about, that anything else would have to be spin-offs of these in Phase 3 or even Phase 4. Like Blackfyre Rebellion, you should do as a sequel to the Regency. It doesn't make sense to just dive into that. It's too similar. But I would guess that with that subscriber dip in the past year really frightened HBO and its parent company AT&T into action. And that's not to say AT&T were dragging their feet on this. The old administration was. AT&T jumped into this, as you've seen in my reports, saying when they bought it, they had that big conference and said, you need to be cranking out more content to compete with Disney+. HBO is not the only game in town anymore. You're resting on your laurels. Richard Plepler refused to listen to them. Now he's gone. If he was good at running HBO, he'd still be doing it, and he's not. So AT&T already wanted to expand, and they knew this was coming, and that now the announcement is out there that Star Wars having a dozen shows like that has really stopped any remaining foot dragging and spurred them into action. The subscriber loss from Game of Thrones, I mean, it was not crippling, but it was noticeable. And basically, Plepler salting the earth on his way out, he didn't plan for a next big hit show after Game of Thrones ended, because he didn't expect to be with the network that long after that. That after Game of Thrones, what was the big thing that HBO followed up on the next spring season? Yes, there was Watchmen, but it was a one-shot show, not a franchise. That they didn't really plan out. And you need more than one show. What are we going to do to anchor this? They just treated it like the end of history, because for them, they were getting their golden parachute. So that whole mentality of we have no competitors that they had, actually think what it was like in 2017, where they went, you want us to make more than one Game of Thrones show? Well, look at how desperate they are now with the rise of Netflix, Amazon, Disney+. Imagine the world we lived in before The Mandalorian and Disney+. It really feels like a sea change, a chapter break. And that's the past 2 years. Amazon is with richest man in the world, was richest man in the world, Bezos, before he spent it. They are dumping money into Amazon's Lord of the Rings and on Amazon's Wheel of Time. We have started seeing concept art they're putting out and set photos for Wheel of Time. That is a major franchise. That HBO can't just have one big show anymore. House of the Dragon cannot sustain that entire network when Star Wars has half a dozen concurrently running shows. Well, 3 in spring, 3 in winter, you know what I mean. And not just on Disney, but every of these other ones. They have half a dozen competitors at any given time. So AT&T isn't stupid. Everything we've heard from them, they've made smart decisions that I would make, so I've never really had any reason to complain. They're not idiots the way Plepler was. AT&T knows they need to expand the franchise of Westeros just to remain competitive, which is great news for us. And then you get into, well, these are the 6 things you could dive into, doesn't mean you should. Because some of these would be oversaturation, some of these aren't as strong as the others, case in point, Blackfyre Rebellion. And like I said, the 3 factors are audience familiarity, exciting new stuff, and do you have sufficient source material? And it's not a direct sequel to anything. Each of these prequels has a different selling point. Some of them are balanced, some of them are really strong on one point but weaker on the other ones. Robert's Rebellion, for example, is the most familiar of any of the prequels. It's got characters who were alive in Game of Thrones. That's the familiarity prequel. Dunk and Egg has probably the most detailed source material for the first 3 of them anyway. It's not finished, but if they just want to do the first 3 as movies, and then the other ones as they come out years from now, because again, they're movies, you can pause between them, there's time skips. Dunk and Egg is even more extensive than Robert's Rebellion, where you need to make dialogue, you need to cobble together some things. Dunk and Egg is pretty much ready to film. I mean, it's even been adapted into graphic novels. They're great. So Robert's Rebellion is high familiarity, decent source material. Dunk and Egg is more source material, some familiarity, because it's the grandparents of people in Game of Thrones, and like 3-year-old Walder Frey's in it. And it's the brother of Maester Aemon. Dance of the Dragons is sort of a nice balance because it has the most source material of any of the other prequels, that it's got this extensive 60,000 word outline from an in-universe history book. Whereas Dunk and Egg, it's a fully narrativized chapter focusing on 2 characters. Dance of the Dragons is 60,000 words on this continent-spanning war. So, 6 of one, a dozen of the other. It's compared to Targaryen Conquest or Blackfyre Rebellion, or Robert's Rebellion for that matter, it's more or less the most detailed amount from beginning to end. And on top of that, Dance of the Dragons in outline form is finished. Dunk and Egg isn't narrativized beyond the first 3. But it's a good balance of source materials, pretty strong. The prequel novellas that are out, decent amount of familiarity in the sense that they're locations we know, and they've mentioned the Dance of the Dragons of Game of Thrones, and these famous dragons are in it, like Vagar. And its selling point is, these dragon versus dragon fights, the Targaryen prequel, where Targaryens are the central characters. Decent amount of that. Valyria prequel is at another extreme, though. The Valyria prequel, if Robert's Rebellion is our selling point is familiarity, Valyria prequel is sort of the opposite end of the spectrum of exotic new things, which by definition are not familiar, but it's treating that as a selling point. Also, the Targaryens aren't the central characters at first, to the extent they are in House of the Dragon, where pretty much everyone is a Targaryen. Valyria the selling point is it's the origin story of the Targaryens from obscurity, and on top of that, it's the origin story of the Free Cities, and also showcasing Summer Islanders and Yeeti. But that's the exciting new stuff one, and it is very different from the other 5, which are all civil wars in Westeros, let's be honest. At Blackfyre Rebellion, it's too similar to the other ones. There's not enough source material. Martin will write source material for it in Fire and Blood Part 2, but he's not going to get to that until the main novels are finished. So that's probably the weakest idea, and on top of that, you wouldn't run Targaryen Conquest opposite House of the Dragons, just too similar. Targaryens fighting with dragons. Even Robert's Rebellion isn't even trying to use dragons in it, but these romantic rivalries. So I've been thinking out loud through most of this, but this is purely for fun, purely for speculation. I just mean to be entertaining here. It's not as if I'm really in charge, but okay, if I was in charge, how would I plan out a Game of Thrones cinematic universe? what they should do with the franchise in phases like how Marvel has phases. Well, phase 1 was Game of Thrones. Phase 2, we know, will start with House of the Dragon, but it's all it's early phase 2 and late phase 2, that if House of the Dragon hasn't started airing yet and they're already discussing Dunk and Egg and Robert's Rebellion, depending on how fast they do them, it'll be like how Iron Man 2 and Captain America 1 and Thor 1 are all considered part of phase 1 of Marvel, that Iron Man 1 was like phase 0 to them. So broadly, if they even make Dunk and Egg and Robert's Rebellion, because it's only going to be 4 seasons at most, if they start making Robert's Rebellion concurrently with House of the Dragon season 4 or 3, and it ends roughly at the same time as House of the Dragon does, because it's shorter, let's consider all that phase 2. And like the first 3 Dunk and Eggs, which are finished, they could do like 1 a year, every other year, through the end of phase 2, okay? Or even 4 and 5, because he said 4 and 5 out of 12 Dunk and Eggs that are planned are mostly finished. So that's what I think phase 2 should have, and if we're lucky and they really want to throw money at the screen, Valyria, because Valyria is so different from the other stories that it wouldn't count as oversaturation. That it's such a different story, different locations, if you were going to do, and here's another Star Wars thing with yet another Jedi, but then you go, oh no, here's a thing about the Hutts, or here's a thing about the Mandalorians, or the criminal underworld. It's different enough, Valyria, that I think you could, if they want to put the money into that. Best case scenario for me is House of the Dragon, and then like 3 years into it, we start getting Robert's Rebellion and Valyria, and like movies, actual movies for Dunk and Egg with limited theatrical release. That is really up there, though. And I think realistically they're only going to do 2 series and Dunk and Egg movies on top of that, and whatever animated thing they make. Maybe Valyria would work as an animated project instead, because there's so much visual stuff you have to do on that scale. They can play around with it. Because Valyria you can do independently of all the other stuff. That's another big factor. It doesn't matter when you do Valyria compared to the other stuff. And then if I'm describing phase 3 off the top of my head, which would be like literally 7 years from now, 8 years from now, imagine where we were 8 years ago. Game of Thrones season 2. But how little we knew then. But thinking like, okay, what do they do after House of the Dragon ends? After a short Robert's Rebellion show ends? Well, phase 3 would be adapting the middle Dunk and Eggs, which I don't know if they'd get through 4 and 5 by then, or Martin would have to explain to them. He has outlined what they do in their later adventures, though it'd be a little shakier because it's just outlines. But okay, they'd have to shift actors because they're aging up. You'd get the middle Dunk and Eggs, maybe even the final Dunk and Eggs by phase 3. And what would be the next mainstay show? Well, the logical sequel to House of the Dragon is the Regency show, which I think they have a combined run of 10 years. Dance plus Regency is like a 10-year story. And after the Regency, you go into the Blackfyre Rebellion. Depending on how fast they do that with how many seasons they want to use on that, I don't know if we'd see Blackfyre Rebellion in late phase 3 or early phase 4. But it's not Marvel. It's not going to go on forever like that. There's 6 more or less core prequel eras. And then you could have a spin-off like Nymeria or Sons of the Dragon. But wondering, wow, we'll be running out of material in 15 years is a problem we want to have. Realistically, I'm telling you, the mission statement is have a successful era of multiple prequels so that whenever Martin finishes the final book in the main series of A Song of Ice and Fire, HBO seriously considers following the money by making a reboot that's a closer adaptation of the books, knowing what the final books are. And hiring competent writers who don't even go off of his outline. Benioff and Weiss had an outline, they ignored it. So I am confident that Winds of Winter Book 6 will come out reasonably soon. I think he's going to tie it into releasing House of the Dragon. I don't think it'll come soon. Just within a year or two, I always think, but it seems from what he's saying near completion. Though I agree, who knows how long it'll take for him to come out with the massive 7th and final book. It took him 10 years to write book 6. Would it be fair to assume it'll take him 10 years to write book 7? So, I said this before in other videos, book 6 on its own, even if Martin dies or gets hit by lightning, book 6 will be different enough from the TV show to make people realize we were played for fools, this isn't the real story. But I do want the final book, but I don't think the 7th and final A Song of Ice and Fire novel will be done by the end of House of the Dragon. Or maybe it'll be done by the end of a Regency show. I mean, 10 years from now is the figure I'm working with. That it's not, okay, this is the end of the Dance of the Dragons, and it's the Regency of Aegon III. They are not going to be discussing a reboot of A Song of Ice and Fire. They're going to be discussing next season is the Regency. 10 years from now, after the Regency ends, they'll be debating, well, do we do Blackfyre? Or, wow, the next book came out. Do we try to reboot it? A new adaptation erasing the old one, which had so many problems. That will literally be 10 years from now, and I'm not a magic 8-ball. I can't predict that, other than that's on the horizon, and the future is fuzzy by that point. I'm not sure what they're going to do, on top of all the animated projects they could do, and it would be nice if the Valyria thing and the animated anthologies turn into real projects about the Summer Isles, or Yeti, maybe even a limited, it's not that much material, maybe you could do the rise of Xander Quo, who united the Summer Isles, as like a TV movie, in live action, spinning it off from the cartoons, or this is the story of the Long Night in Yeti, a self-contained thing about the Bloodstone Emperor, as like a stylized TV movie spun off from a 10-minute long animated anthology piece. But we'll start running low on prequel eras 15 years from now. But I think by that point, the franchise will be in a position to do other stuff set in the world of Westeros. Because Martin always says, this is a big world that I will never be able to tell all of the stories in this world. That just because I didn't say them doesn't mean they don't have stories of their own off in the background. Although he said, paradoxically, I don't want other people to write stuff in my universe. He'll then say, but there's stories left to tell I didn't get to. So it's good writing always makes up for everything. So, I'm going to make a short summation of this video because I've been rambling, and I'm going to post it first. And the longer version that you just listened through is for everyone who, for some reason or another, actually likes hearing me discuss this out long form. Of, well, how did I reach that conclusion in the short 1-minute version? So, a lot of things are in motion, and even the people reporting this say they're just pitch discussions, nothing might come from them. From Duncan Egg or Robert's Rebellion or the animated thing, though I'd really like to hear stuff about the Valyria show. By the way, remember, back in summer 2018, they had to copyright every pitch they made, and you have to register copyrights. So we didn't think to check at the time, but yeah, the online US copyright database will list off Game of Thrones Duncan Egg prequel pitch, and I'm checking it on a daily basis to see if they've registered these things. So I'm going to keep regularly checking all the copyright things and trademarks of what are they doing legally now? What are they setting up? And stay tuned for more updates as we get them. We're finally entering an era of news again, and if nothing else, this is all theoretical, they are filming House of the Dragon in April. We know this. We're going to get a lot of stuff soon. Stick around for news.